Hi, I'm Dr. Helen Smith, and today I have on a very special guest to talk with us about an important topic, men and violence. Lawrence Kane is the author, along with Chris Wilder, of the award-winning book, The Little Black Book of Violence, What Every Young Man Needs to Know About Fighting. Welcome to the show, Lawrence. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, let's start with the obvious. What got you interested in the topic of violence? Did something happen in your past, or is it just a passion of yours?
A little bit of both. I've been involved in something more than 300 violent altercations, working primarily stadium security. A few other things have happened as well. And I've never, really understood until recently why it is that otherwise intelligent people do just monumentally stupid things. It's something that, I saw a lot of it and I want to understand it better. I'll give you an example. When I was a sophomore in college, my fraternity got into a big scrap with another house over a parking spot. We had a big parking lot, they didn't. A couple other guys parked in our lot. And one thing led to another. Soon there's 30, 40 guys out in the street pounding on each other. At the time, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And frankly, it was a little bit of fun too. But all of a sudden, this guy named Ron came down the stairs with a loaded rifle. It took four of us to keep him from using it over a parking spot. And if you think about that, this guy was a straight A student, good guy. And for some reason, he had in his head it was a good idea to bring a gun to a fist fight. And, if you imagine what would have happened if he'd pulled that trigger 25 years later, maybe just now he'd be getting out of prison. That's a pretty big deal.
That is a big deal, and it sounds like something similar that happened. It actually did happen in our parking lot here at the University of Tennessee campus, where at a convenience store, a couple of football players got out and robbed some other students of something like a couple bucks and change or something, and they had a pellet gun, but who's going to know that? And they ended up, I think they did get off, but you never know what could happen. I mean, for all they know, somebody could have pulled a weapon back on them, so it's really a stupid thing to do. I agree, but there are times when, but sometimes violence is necessary. But specifically, your book looks at men between the ages of 18 and about 35, young men. And why do you think that's such an important time to learn about violence, when to use it and when not to use it?
Well, to address your parting shot there, absolutely, violence is sometimes necessary. The challenge is knowing the difference. And when you get guys who are young and they don't have a lot to lose, they don't have established relationships, you put them in a tense situation, maybe something that's emotional, bring some cute girls in, stir the home run soup, and you get a pretty good recipe for something bad to happen. Sure, there's times when you need to fight, and sure, there's people who get into fights who aren't young men. But when you look at all the statistics out there, the preponderance of them is things that's done generally by men, generally by younger men. And part of the reason we wanted to write the book is to help people understand when is it the right thing to do, when is it the wrong thing to do, how to set those parameters for yourself, and really how to know how to do it effectively if you have to. Because let's face it, sometimes you really do need to fight, but most of the time it's avoidable.
Now, let's talk about, there's a big difference between fighting because of ego. For example, say somebody calls you a name and fighting to save your life. Can you kind of describe the difference to our viewers?
Sure, that's an insightful question because to most people, the vast majority of people, it looks the same. They don't know the difference. And to coin a term or to borrow a term from Rory Miller and Mark McYoung, violence is kind of the new dark taboo. It's kind of like sex ed was back in the 50s. People were doing it, but they didn't really understand it. So this difference between fighting for your ego thing and fighting for your life thing is really about social violence versus predatory violence. In social violence, your goal is generally to have dominance over somebody, keep them out of your territory, for example, like the parking lot thing I was referring to earlier. Whereas predatory violence, the goal is really about violence. And when you're involved in one of those kind of situations, unless the predator feels that it's too costly to attack you, you're in a situation where you're going to have to fight. It's going to be serious. You're going to need to, not lose. You don't have to win, but you can't afford to lose.
One of the things you said struck me. You said that violence is sort of taboo. In some sense, I think we're not violent enough in our society. People are, I think, sometimes afraid of violence, especially in the schools. For example, they tell kids don't even draw a picture of a gun. And I think in our society, we don't really talk about violence, the boundaries, where to go with that. And I think what you're saying is we don't really teach young men. Used to dads taught young men maybe the boundaries of violence. When do you stop? When should you fight? When should you not fight? And now I don't think that anybody really teaches boys much of anything. Just don't fight, they tell them. And that's what the society says. So I think it's good to have, somebody out there who kind of tells you a little bit more where to draw the line.
Absolutely. That's something that's very important because let's face it, for most of society, violence doesn't happen very often. If you go to a middle class or upper level neighborhood, for the most part, and you go ask people, oh, I got a pushing, shoving match kind of in high school, but I consider that a fight. Or I saw a guy get mugged once or whatever. For some segments of society, it happens a lot. And if you don't understand the difference between, for example, as we talked earlier, between social violence and predatory violence, you can react incorrectly. You can react in a way that's going to really mess up your life or allow someone else.
Right. Well, that's a good time. Let's talk about when it's time to retreat and when it's time to fight back. This is a topic you talk about a lot in your book, and I had a blog post on your book, and one of our commenters called Cinder Keys wrote in a question, and I think we have that. But let me ask the question. Say you glance at somebody, Cinder Keys asks, that person glares back and says, "What are you looking at?" Obviously, the correct response isn't to glare back and reply, "Nothing, what's your problem?" But how far should your good faith effort go? Is it enough to say something friendly, "Hey, we're cool"? Or do you actually have to walk away? And if you walk away, mightn't the bully take this as a sign of fear and follow you? What do you do in a situation like this?
Well, the short answer is it depends. Every situation is unique. But having said that, generally speaking, that "Hey, what are you looking at?" kind of thing is a dominance thing. So if you walk away, generally speaking, they're going to let you go because they're going to think they won. Ooh, look at the little weenie walking away. Well, the thing is that, yeah, if it comes to face, they won. But if it comes to reality, so did you, because you chose intentionally to retreat. You didn't get sucked up in the game and you didn't do something stupid. Now, there's another way to handle that too. You don't actually have to get up and go. But the good thing is if you get up and go and you try to walk away and they follow you, it's going to hold you really well in court when you have to explain why you stomped a mud hole in it. On the other hand, you can try to change the channel. Somebody says, "Hey, what are you looking at?" And you go, something, for example, "Your shirt. That looks just like the one my ex-wife got me, but it looks a hell of a lot better on you, man." And smile and laugh. Generally, that'll change the subject. It'll change the channel, get you off the escalado thing.
So kind of use humor a little bit if you can to sort of diffuse the situation if it's one of social dominance.
Absolutely. Most things can be avoided. Many things can be de-escalated. It's a very, very small band where you really need to get physical with somebody in most cases.
Well, let's go there. What is the difference, say, between fighting and self-defense? And I'm really thinking of, you're walking. This happened to me in New York City when I first moved there. I wasn't paying attention. I'm walking down the street for my graduate program, and a guy jumps me with a knife, okay? Not necessarily that situation, but, what do you do if you're in a fight for your life? Or what would be the difference between, say, fighting and self-defense?
So that's another good question. Self-defense primarily is about not being there. So that's using awareness to situational awareness so that, you see the guy lurking in the alley with a knife and you decide to go down a different street. The avoidance part is how you do that so that he doesn't end up following you or you end up getting, into another situation. But generally speaking, you can avoid most violence with good situational awareness. So if I say, I'm going to go learn karate to know how to do self-defense, I'm training for that little itty bitty time when I can't get away from it, I can't avoid it, and I can't de-escalate it. So that's maybe 3% of the time, and that 3% of the time you have no choice but to fight. But fighting isn't self-defense. So let me give you I'll try to be legal without being boring about it for a second. Self-defense is an affirmatory defense. You say, "Yes, Your Honor, I killed this guy. but I was avoiding being murdered myself. Therefore, it's self-defense. There's a competing harm that outweighs what I did. So, in order to be able to get away with self-defense in court, you have to be completely blameless. If you start with a, hey, what are you looking at? You let it escalate. The guy pulls a knife and you shoot him. It's still not self-defense because you'd allowed it to escalate. So there's a pretty big difference. Primarily, self-defense is about not being there. Fighting is about what you do when you've screwed up your self-defense. Unless, of course, you're a law enforcement officer or somebody who has to move towards the trouble. That's a different situation.
Now, you and Chris Wilder talk a lot about legal ramifications in the book, and I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, I think in our society that everybody is so afraid of being sued that people are really scared to get involved. And I think that because people are so afraid that you're letting kind of the criminals sort of run the place because everyone's so scared of violence that they don't fight back. And I think it allows bad people to flourish, and I think it leads good ones to be afraid. Oh, I can't fight back or do anything because I might go to jail. Do you have a comment on this? I mean, it's just something I've thought of over the years because I guess I see things from a different perspective. I mainly deal with pretty innocent people who have been in tragic circumstances that have led them, to get killed. So, what do you say about thinking too much about the legal ramifications?
Well, absolutely. One of the key features of our book is what we call Appendix A, which is entitled "How Far Are You Willing to Go?" And the idea is that it really depends on your circumstances. And I'm a black belt in karate. I've been in a lot of scraps. I have the ability to interfere in something and not get hurt that most other people wouldn't be able to do. But it's really important before you're faced with that tough choice of, am I going to get involved or am I going to walk away? And how am I going to live with myself one way or the other? That you think about it. And so we encourage people to fill out the appendix. It goes through a bunch of scenarios and it says, I'm willing to X and I'm not willing to X. And it's very personal. It's up to the individual reader. You go through it, you read the book, you go back, you see if anything's changed. And the idea is to help people understand what their priorities are, what's it worth to you, what's it not, what are you willing to fight for? Am I willing to fight because somebody insulted me? Am I willing to fight because somebody insulted my friend? Am I willing to fight because, a drug-crazed maniac kicked down my door and is coming at me with a knife? Well, there's a whole lot of gray areas in between, and people really need to think about, what are the consequences? What's it worth it to you? And make a really informed decision when or if they come across something that's a bad situation. Because there's a cost to getting involved, there's a cost to not getting involved. And for the most part, nobody thinks about that until it's too late.
I think that's a good point. There's a cost to not getting involved also. And I guess I look at it from a psychological or almost a sociological viewpoint that our society is the worst for people not getting involved at all. I'm not talking about somebody insulting you, but I'm talking about like when bad things happen to people that many times people are afraid. And just from my own experience dealing with many people who are violent, their violence escalates because nobody will say stop. You've got to stop that. It just goes on until they get to the point where they think it's okay to damage someone or kill or harm someone. And so I think that in some ways people, it's important to get involved, particularly if you're the parent of such a person, of a child, or in some way you could intervene and take action against somebody who is potentially violent.
You're right. The challenge is you have to understand what it is you're getting into. If I walk down the street and I see two people beating on each other, one of them's on top, and he's winning, how do I know if he's the good guy or the bad guy? There's a section in our book we talk about creating witnesses because that's kind of an important aspect so that bystanders know what's going on. But the same thing happens when you get involved. If you didn't see the whole thing, you have to be really cautious about how you get involved. Sometimes it's pick up the phone, call the cops. Sometimes it's yell at the people to knock it off. Sometimes it's yell at the people that you have called the cops. Sometimes you go hands-on. And you really need to make sure that it's an informed decision whenever you decide to do that.
That's really good advice. Let's turn to another topic, and that's women who are violent. You say in the book that women who are violent could be more dangerous than men. What general advice do you have for men dealing with a woman who's violent?
You know, it's an interesting thing. In the last 5 or 6 years, there's actually been a pretty big escalation, comparatively speaking, in women who do violent things. But generally speaking, women don't do social violence. They do the gear done violence. Kind of the example is if I'm up in Alaska and I'm walking through the woods and I see a grizzly bear, I'm within 25 feet or so. If, you know, it's fed, it's happy, I might be able to walk away. But if its cubs happen to be between, you know, if I'm in between it and its cubs, I'm toast. You know, female violence is generally about get her done. And so, you know, women are you know, primarily hard to set off, but when you do, you end up with, you know, the Lorena Bobbitt sort of thing. But here's the difference. So let's say Chris and I get into a knockdown, drag out fight, right? Just got upset over a football game or something. He beats the tar out of me. 2 hours later, we might be out drinking beer and having pool, you know, shooting pool. Yeah, if his girlfriend and my wife get in a fight, that grudge is going to last till Judgment Day. I mean, it's just a different beast. Then you add in how the courts look at things. So, you know, if the big strong guy beats up the, you know, small frail woman and it gets to court, unless, you know, she was armed or there's some really unusual circumstances it's caught on film or whatever the whole thing, you know, it's just not going to go well because most judges and juries look at that and they look at the size and gender disparity and they say, you know, um, it's been nice seeing you. Let's come back in 20 years and we'll talk about probation. And you know, I'm joking a little bit, but the courts really are stacked against you. So, in general, when women get violent, call the authorities and let the professionals handle it because honestly, the deck's stacked against you, and it's really not something you want to interfere in if you have an option. Clearly, you know, she's got a knife or a gun, she's coming for you. Okay, you know, you got to live through it and take your chances. But when it's you know, purely something where you know, ladies getting out of control and you know, you have the option of leaving and letting somebody else deal with it, let somebody else deal with it.
Let's turn to the topic of domestic violence. Sometimes you can't get out of the situation. It's happening in your own home. Studies show that women often instigate partner violence. And in fact, there was one study done by the Center for Disease Control that found that 71% of women were instigators of non-reciprocal violence. That is when only one person was fighting. It was the woman and not the man. Um, Men usually are the ones, however, that end up in jail if somebody calls the cops, usually the woman or maybe a neighbor. How do you keep yourself out of jail if you're a man in this instance? You know, what are some things that you can do?
So the first most important thing is it should never have gotten there in the first place. If your relationship's broke to the point where it gets physical, you've missed a whole lot of stuff. But let's set that aside for a minute and say, okay, she just hit you and you're really upset and you really want to hit back. The most important thing you can do is stick your hands in your pockets and leave. And when you come back to get your stuff, you bring a cop with you and do the civil assist thing and have him watch as, or her, or them, watch as you pick up your stuff and you leave, and that's the end of the relationship. Let's face it, there's really no excuse for abusing anybody. Male, female, you just don't hit your partner. It's not a healthy relationship. And usually there are signs of that along the way that you can, you know, get counseling, you can do some kind of intervention, you can, you know, set that stuff aside proactively. But if it gets to violence and you're being struck by somebody, if you let your temper get the best of you and you hit her back, you're toast. Let's face it, guys. You know, domestic violence is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's designed to get arrests and it's designed to get convictions. When police officers show up, in most states, they got to take somebody away with them. Usually it's the guy. So if you don't just stick your hands in your pocket and leave, you're setting yourself up for some really bad stuff that could cost you your job, could cost you your freedom, could cost you the ability to see your kids. It's just not a good thing. Just leave.
And I'll make this final point that I think that's really good advice, but I think at the same time, men have to fight the system and change those laws and fight back against that multi-billion-dollar industry as much as they can, because to hold one gender accountable and the other one completely non-accountable doesn't sound like true justice to me.
Well, it's not, but remember, the courts aren't necessarily about justice. They're about resolution, right? The officers are there to arrest a situation. The courts are there to get convictions. There's an awful lot of politics in it. And you're right, the laws need to change. The system needs to be fair. And let's face it, there really are, a lot of women who are battered, who are beaten. I mean, it's a scary, bad thing. And, there is a need to protect them. However, as that study pointed out and some of the other research I've done, a lot of times that's the one who hits first. And so there's also some education that's necessary because, as our society has evolved, we've kind of made this big taboo about violence, and we're saying, hey, violence is bad. Well, it's not always bad. But what happens is, just like, the criminals on the street who are doing things because they can, you sometimes get women who are willing to manipulate the system to go against the guy. And they'll, at any cost, I want to destroy. It goes back to that, it's not social violence. It's there to end I have a threat, I'm going to end the threat, and if I got to use the system on you, I'm going to do it. And you're right, we need to make that a little harder. But we do have to be able to protect, anybody who's involved in a domestic violence situation. And people need to understand what the warning signs are and get out before it ever gets to that point.
But just one final point, it sounds to me like you're just telling the man to beat it. He doesn't have any recourse, which in some sense is good advice, but you're saying that the system should really only protect women. And I guess I'm saying, gee, I mean, man, it sounds like the man doesn't have any rights. He could basically be shoved out of his home, told to leave. She doesn't have any other recourse.
No. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, don't hit her back. Do it with your attorney. Do it through the legal system. I'm saying don't physically.
I agree.
So here's the thing. So I'm going to be really crass for a second. Put it this way, okay, guys. That billion-dollar industry is stacked against you. They want to bend you over and fuck you up the ass. And if you hit the woman, you're handing them a can of Crisco. Okay, don't do it that way. Get your attorney. Do it the right way. Don't do it physically, because you're just going to make it worse for you. You're going to lose.
And on that note, we'll end. That's good advice, but the attorney's important. Lawrence, thank you so much for taking time out to talk to our viewers today and to me about this interesting topic. And you can read more about Lawrence's work at the Little Book, Black Book of Violence. It's a terrific book. I read it cover to cover, and I got to say, I really, really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.